Go ahead.
May I proceed? Okay. All right, we're going to point number 2 of your testimony, which was video footage that you reviewed. And I think you established that you had obtained this from the evidence bookings that pertained to the Marc Schaffel residence. Is that correct?
Correct.
And what sheriff's identification number was on the item that you referred to?
Item 1316, 1316.
And item 1316 is booked into sheriff's evidence, correct?
Correct.
And it remains booked into sheriff's evidence as we sit here right now, correct?
The original is, yes.
The original. And you gave us a copy of that, right?
Correct.
And do you know if that's the same as your sheriff's item 913, 10, 11 and 12?
I don't know without reviewing materials.
In any event, what you reviewed it was a CD, or a DVD, or what?
The original, I believe, was either it was a cassette tape. I don't recall if it was a beta cassette tape or a regular cassette tape.
Okay, and you provided a copy of that, to us in the form of a DVD, is that right?
Correct.
So the original is some kind of tape. Now, what did you review? You didn't review a beta cassette tape, did you?
I reviewed both, actually. I participated in the process of changing it over to the DVD format and watched it at that time.
Alright, but most recently when you reviewed it for this quote that you recited on direct examination, did you review the beta cassette tape or the DVD?
The DVD.
Alright, and that's because beta cassette tapes have to be played on some kind of a professional machine, is that right?
Correct. And we only have one, and it's in Santa Barbara.
Alright, so to lay the foundation here for something we'll do in the future, I understand that you will produce to the court your sheriff's identification number 1316, which is the original beta cassette tape, is that correct?
Correct.
And then you have a DVD that is, how is that labeled?
It would be labeled, item 1316, and more specifically the actual title that was on the cassette tape in question.
I'm sorry. I just want to make sure I'm clear, and I'm not clear. If we say at some future date we would like to play this DVD that's in sheriff's evidence right now, how do we refer to it? 1316, the DVD? Or is there another number?
The most appropriate would be to say item 1316 and then also provide the title, MJ, Bashir, Summer 2003.
Alright, so that's what you reviewed. Now, I understand you did not review recently 913, 10, 11 and 12.
Correct.
Which were sheriff's numbers. Did you ever review those?
I may have. I'm not certain at this point.
Alright, and then going to your third point, you referred to a Louise Palanker interview, correct?
Correct.
And you and, I believe it was Detective Zelis, were present during this interview, is that correct?
That's correct.
And it was surreptitiously tape recorded, correct?
Yes, it was.
And how long did that interview last?
I believe it was approximately 45 minutes in length.
And that particular item is on a DVD, is that right?
CD, yes.
CD. Was it recorded on a CD or?
It was recorded on a digital recorder and downloaded into CD format.
Okay, so the actual item that is sheriff's item 1790 is the original recording, is that correct?
The CD recording.
And that's in sheriff's evidence, booked into sheriff's evidence at the substation, is that correct?
Right.
And you agree to bring those to court for whatever purpose we'll use them in the future, is that correct?
Absolutely.
Alright, thank you. Based on that, I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Nothing further.
All right, you may step down.
Detective Robel.
You're still under oath. You may be seated.
Detective Robel, during the course of this investigation, were you involved in an interview with Debbie Rowe?
Yes, I was.
And was that interview tape recorded?
Yes, it was.
And was it tape recorded with her knowledge?
Yes, it was.
And who else was present during the taping?
Lieutenant Klapakis.
And do you recall where that took place?
Yes.
Where was that?
In Los Angeles.
Do you recall what day that took place?
I believe it was on March the 3rd, 2004.
So over a year ago?
Yes.
All right, I'm going to ask you a few questions about that interview. First of all, were you asked to review that tape?
Yes, I was.
And you were asked to review it in detail, correct?
That's correct.
And did you do that?
Yes, I did.
And when did you do that?
Yesterday.
And did you compare it to a transcript?
Yes, I did.
Now, during that conversation that you had with Miss Rowe, did she at any time during the course of that transcript describe the defendant as a good parent?
No, she didn't.
At any time during that conversation that you had with her over a year ago, did she describe him as a wonderful father?
No, she didn't.
At any time during the course of that interview with her over a year ago, did she describe him as a caring person?
No.
And does she at any time during that interview use the word generous to describe the defendant?
No.
During the course of the conversation that you had with Miss Rowe over a year ago, did she express to you, during the course of that interview, comments about her concerns of his parenting skills?
Objection. Leading.
Overruled.
Yes.
And in particular, what did she say?
Objection. Opinion. Relevance.
Overruled. You may answer.
She referred to Michael as a sociopath and his children as being possessions.
Did she at other points during the conversation express any other areas of concern?
Yes.
About the defendant and the children's relationship?
Yes, she did.
How many different areas did she talk about? Without going into the details of what she talked about, the areas, how many areas of concern?
I recall there were 3.
And did each one of those reflect negatively upon the defendant's parenting skills?
Objection. Leading.
Calls for a conclusion. Sustained.
Were those 3 areas discussed in the context of him being a good or a bad parent?
Yes.
And was it good or bad?
It was bad.
During the course of the interview with Miss Rowe, did you discuss the topic of whether or not the comments that she made during the course of her interview that was included in the Maury Povich program were truthful?
Objection. Leading.
Let me rephrase that, Judge. I need to rephrase it anyhow, to be correct. During the course of your interview with Miss Rowe over a year ago, did you discuss with her the topic of the truthfulness of her statements made during the 9-hour interview that occurred at Mr. Schaffel's house?
Yes, I did.
And what did she say?
She told me that she had a plan since she got divorced from Michael in 1999.
Did she tell you who made the plan up?
Yes.
Who?
She and Mr. Jackson.
Together?
Yes.
And what was the plan?
Objection. Relevance. Foundation.
Your Honor, this is impeachment.
I'm going to sustain the objection. I don't understand how that question could lead to an answer that would impeach something she said in front of this jury.
That the comments were truthful.
But that's not the question that's been asked. You asked about a plan she had with Mr. Jackson. So I'm sustaining the objection.
Were you present during Miss Rowe's testimony here in court?
Yes, I was.
And did you hear Miss Rowe testify about the statements that she made during that 9-hour interview?
Yes.
And you heard her testify that those statements were truthful in court?
Correct.
Now, did you have a conversation with Miss Rowe over a year ago when she told you about the comments? About the same comments that she made in court here and whether they were truthful or not?
Objection. Misstates the evidence, leading, and vague.
Let me rephrase it, Judge. I might be able to solve the problem. During your conversation with Miss Rowe, did she say anything to you that was inconsistent with her statement in this courtroom that those statements were true when she made them on the film?
Yes.
What did she say?
Objection. Calls for a narrative. Vague.
Overruled.
She said that she and Mr. Jackson, when they got divorced, that they had a plan.
Objection. Same objection as before. He's trying to answer the same question, Your Honor.
Sustained.
All right, you told us all about the plan. Tell us what she said after the plan.
She said she.
Objection. Vague.
Overruled. You may answer.
That she stuck with her plan to talk positive about Mr. Jackson, as she's done throughout news conferences that she's had since they were divorced.
Did she indicate to you during this conversation whether those statements were true or false?
Yes, she did.
What did she say?
And she says that they were false.
All right, I want to go on to another subject. Excuse me just a second. Alright, Sergeant Robel, I'm handing you the exhibit book. First of all, you recognize those as being the Neverland ranch logs, correct?
Yes, I do.
Now, during the course of the search warrant at the ranch on November 18 of 2003, were certain logs seized from the ranch?
Yes, there were.
You're aware of that?
Yes, I am.
And you reviewed those logs, as a matter of fact, have you not?
Yes, I have.
And do any of the logs that you reviewed that were seized from the ranch go beyond the date of January 1, 2003?
No.
Now, there's a medical report, one-page medical report that does, but all the logs themselves were before, correct?
That is correct.
During the course of this investigation, did, to your knowledge, the Santa Barbara Sheriff's Department in any other search warrant seize any records or logs associated with the months of January, February or March of 2003?
No.
Now, in the exhibit book, towards the end, there are logs for the months of February and March of 2003, correct?
Yes.
And what exhibit numbers, what two exhibit numbers are those? They should be tabbed.
335 and 334.
And those logs are log entries from the year 2003, correct?
That is correct.
And those have been described by Mr. Sanger as being government documents. Do you know where they came from?
Yes, I do.
Where did they come from?
It came from the defense.
Do you recall when it was that we obtained those records from the defense?
Yes.
When?
To the best of my recollection, I believe it was about 3 to 4 months prior to us starting trial.
Months?
Actually, excuse me, I'm sorry, weeks.
So they've been in the defense possession for over a year?
That is correct.
Nothing further.
What is the date of your interview with Debbie Rowe?
March the 3rd, 2004.
Did you do an interview with her on February 23, 2004?
Yes, that was I talked with her on the phone.
And that was recorded, correct?
That was not recorded.
The transcript. Do you have a transcript of the interview you're referring to?
Yes, I do.
And may I approach, Your Honor, just to take a look at the transcript?
Yes.
Okay, and you say you just listened to the tape the other evening?
I listened to it yesterday.
Do you ever ask the question, is Michael a good parent?
I don't recall asking that.
You never had a conversation with her about his parenting skills at all, did you?
I don't recall asking that question.
Okay, in response to the prosecutor's question to you, you indicated that Ms. Rowe, during your conversation, had not said some of the things she said in open court, correct?
Correct.
But there are things she said in open court that you didn't ask her about in your interview, correct?
Correct.
She said Michael Jackson was generous in open court. Do you remember that?
Yes.
You never asked her if Michael Jackson was generous, did you?
I don't recall asking that.
She said that Michael Jackson was her friend, correct?
Correct.
You never asked her in your interview if Michael Jackson was her friend, right?
I don't recall asking that.
In fact, at one point in your interview, she said she wasn't really supposed to talk a lot about Michael Jackson, because her lawyer had advised her as such, right?
Correct.
And when she said that to you, you didn't ask her a lot of questions about Michael Jackson as a person after that, right?
She volunteered some of the stuff.
Now, at that particular point in time, did you know when she had last seen Michael Jackson? Excuse me, let me rephrase that better. At the point in time when you interviewed Debbie Rowe, did you know when she had last seen Michael Jackson?
I believe that she had told us that it had been 2 to 3 years.
Now, at the particular point in time when you interviewed Debbie Rowe, she was rather upset about their family law proceeding, true?
No, I don't think that's correct.
Do you remember she said to you, "Officer, I have Michael's Achilles tendon, I have the kids. I don't have them, but I'm going to have them." Do you remember that?
I remember something to that effect.
Isn't that what she said to you?
She did, Mr. Mesereau, but I don't believe that her child custody issue was going on at that time.
Well, she told you she had a lawyer named Iris Finsilver, did she not?
Yes, she did.
Did you know why she had a lawyer named Iris Finsilver?
At the time, I knew she had her because of the filming that she participated in where Iris was present.
She told you in that interview that she was in a dispute with Mr. Jackson about the children, right?
I don't recall that.
Did you know she was in a dispute with Mr. Jackson about the children when you conducted that discussion with Debbie Rowe?
To the best of my knowledge, I want to say that I did not.
Do you recall in the first page of your interview, and in my transcript it's page 1? I don't know what page it is in yours. It's a different transcript. Do you recall she says, "Let me try and restate that." Look at the fourth quote down of Debbie Rowe. It starts with, Iris. Do you see that?
It said, Iris, I.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, I'm there.
She says, fuck his defense at this point. I want the kids. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
Did you think that might have some relevance to a dispute between Mr. Jackson and Ms. Rowe when you heard her say that?
By reading it, you could interpret that, but at the time I did not.
Okay, and this was the conversation where she talked about Janet Arvizo's history of orchestrating lawsuits, correct?
Your Honor, I'm going to object as beyond the scope of direct examination. We were very pointed in our questions.
Sustained.
This was a conversation where she said, Michael is very easily manipulated, true?
Object. Same objection.
Sustained.
Now, do you remember Ms. Rowe in this conversation responding to your question, is Michael the kind of person that would keep a journal? Do you remember that?
I do remember that.
And she said, he doesn't keep a journal. He's not organized enough to keep a journal. Do you remember that?
Object. Same objection.
I think it's all in. They opened the door on this conversation about Mr. Jackson, Your Honor.
I'm having the same difficulty with you as I'm having with the district attorney. I can't really tell where you're going from that question, and it appears to be beyond the scope. So I'll sustain the objection. If you can rephrase it so I can see it better, that's fine.
Ms. Arvizo. Excuse me. Ms. Rowe. Let me start again. How did this conversation originate? Did you call her?
For this particular interview?
Yes.
Yes. We had a phone discussion, and she agreed to meet with me on a specific date and time.
And where did she meet you?
In the Los Angeles area, Calabasas.
Was her attorney there?
No.
Okay, but you begin the conversation with reference to her attorney, correct? Really on the first page. The sentence we just discussed where it starts by saying, Iris.
Correct.
You discussed her attorney almost at the very beginning of the interview, correct?
Your Honor, I object. Asked and answered.
Sustained.
And this was the interview where she talked about Schaffel and Konitzer and Dieter trying to steal from Mr. Jackson, correct?
Object. Your Honor, beyond the scope.
Sustained.
Ask the court to admonish counsel. This.
Next question.
Yes. No further questions, Your Honor.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
You may step down.
Your Honor, we call as our next witness Duross O'Bryan.
When you get to the witness stand, remain standing. Face the clerk here and raise your right hand.
I do.
Please be seated. State and spell your name for the record.
John Duross O'Bryan. John Duross O'Bryan.
Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. O'Bryan.
Good morning.
What is your occupation, please?
I am a certified public accountant in the state of California.
And by whom are you employed?
With the firm of Alex Partners.
Tell us a little bit about Alex Partners, if you would.
Alex Partners is an international financial consulting firm.
And what is your title with Alex Partners?
I am a managing director.
Prior to joining Alex Partners, did you work with other accounting firms?
I did, yes.
And what were their names?
I started my career in 1978 with the international public accounting firm of Peat, Marwick, Mitchell and Company, now called KPMG. I was there for approximately 6 or 7 years. And I went off to my own firm for about 9 months to a year. And then joined the international public accounting firm of Coopers and Lybrand, which merged and it's now PricewaterhouseCoopers. I was with them basically from 1985 through 2003.
So what type of firms are KPMG and PricewaterhouseCoopers?
They were referred to as the Big Eight accounting firms, which are the large accounting firms. They're international, both domestic and abroad, all over the world.
Alright, let's start with KPMG. Can you tell us a little bit about your experiences there?
As I mentioned, I started in 1978, and I was really auditing, which is accounting. I have an accounting degree. I worked auditing companies' financial statements, auditing individuals' financial statements, and effectively auditing those numbers to make sure they are accurate and in conformity with accounting guidelines.
How would you give a lay definition of what an audit is, general terms?
An audit is basically a function performed by auditors, CPAs that work principally with the Big Eight, or now I think they call them the Final Four accounting firms, that simply looks at, on a test basis, transactions and support the company's financial statements, and then gives an opinion about the accuracy of those financial statements, whether or not they are accurate and whether or not, in fact, they conform with what's called generally accepted accounting principles.
Tell us a little bit about your experiences at PricewaterhouseCoopers.
I started with PricewaterhouseCoopers in 1985, or the predecessor firm. I was there through 2003. I continued doing audits through approximately 2000, 2001. And in about 1988, October the 1st of 1988, I was admitted to the partnership. And on and around that time, I was also asked to begin working, assisting individuals and/or companies in what's called disputes, litigation matters, whether or not there's damages, malpractice issues, whether or not an accountant did something wrong, any type of matter involving a dispute or an investigation.
Have you participated in financial accounting investigations?
I have, yes, on several occasions.
And as it relates to financial advisory services, I think you mentioned that. What kind of engagements have you worked?
Financial advisory services was one of the divisions within the Big Four firms. I was in charge of that in both Los Angeles and in New York. That division does dispute analysis and investigation, work investigations that we're talking about. It also does due diligence work, mergers and acquisitions, bankruptcy work valuation, etc. I was involved in most of those practices of being the partner in charge. But certainly specifically as a partner responsible, I worked on most of those engagements, those type of engagements.
Do those engagements include forensic accounting investigations?
They do, yes. One of the title, DA&I, the I, stands for investigation, which is an accounting investigation of financial records.
Okay, so tell us what specifically you mean when you say, a forensic accounting investigation.
Well, if an audit is really looking at a company's financial statements and looking on a test basis to be able to opine as to the accuracy and conformity with those financial statements with accounting principles, a forensic accounting investigation is completely different. It basically looks at all the records you can possibly get, all of the information you can possibly get, and it attempts to reconstruct what happened and what went on in any period of time. So the scope is completely different and the type of procedures are completely different. It's much more invasive, it's much more intrusive, and it is really, in fact, an investigation, not a sampling of documents like an audit is.
So can you give us an idea of what kind of forensic accounting investigation you have participated in?
I've participated in dozens, some of them involving thousands of dollars at issue, some of them involving billions of dollars at issue, and companies small and large, public, private, and not-for-profit.
And are these investigations primarily for the purposes of litigation, pre-litigation, testifying in court, that type of thing?
Some of them involve litigation. Probably most of them do. But there's a vast majority that could just be an investigation that the company has authorized or the company is asking for or individuals are asking for to ask what's going on within their company. So it may not be a litigation or it may not be a civil or criminal matter. It could simply be that the company is interested in what's going on in their business and asked to have an investigation performed.
Have you previously been asked to testify in California courts or in courts around the country as an expert in the area of a forensic accounting investigation?
I have, yes, on several occasions.
Do you have an accounting degree?
I do, yes. I have a Bachelor of Science degree in accountancy from Northern Arizona University.
Presently, what are your hourly rates at AlixPartners?
My rate on this engagement is $385 an hour.
Okay, I'll try to be quick then. How many hours have you put into this investigation or into this particular task?
I've put in probably 20 to 30 hours possibly.
Okay, so tell us about your assignment in this particular case, the case of People vs. Jackson. Specifically, what were you asked to do in this matter?
I was asked to look at the financial condition of Mr. Jackson leading up to February 2003.
Alright, and did you prepare a PowerPoint presentation to assist the jury in describing just exactly what you did in this case?
I did, yes.
Alright, would you consider this to be a forensic accounting investigation?
The work that we performed was absolutely a forensic accounting investigation, yes.
And have you ever performed other work that entailed a similar task, looking at someone's personal finances for forensic purposes?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, so let's talk about some terminology. What does the term financial condition mean for purposes of your testimony here today?
I'm defining financial condition as basically an individual's assets, their liabilities, their net worth. One's net worth is simply the difference between their assets and liabilities. If you have more assets than liabilities, you have positive net worth. If you have more liabilities than assets, you have negative net worth. So we look at the assets and the liabilities. We look at the income. We look at the expenditures. That's how I would really define one's financial condition, and really how those all interrelate and what kind of condition they're in. Can they afford to pay their bills, etc.?
You're going to be, I'm sure, throwing these words around, so I want to make sure everybody's clear on them. Assets. Would that just be a simple way of saying assets? Would that be property that someone owns?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Assets are really anything that is an asset, which is your house, a car, artwork, intangible things like maybe a copyright. Anything that creates benefit to you is an asset. And so that's what I'm referring to as an asset. A liability is just the opposite of that. It is something that's an obligation. You owe something, somebody something, meaning a bank for your mortgage on your house, a lease on your car, a loan securing some of the copyright things that you have. Any of those there becomes obligations, things that you actually have to pay for. And then the difference between the two is simply a mathematical function of assets minus liabilities equals net worth.
Okay, and can a net worth be positive as well as negative?
Yes, as I mentioned.
Go ahead.
If you have more assets than liabilities, conceptually, if you gain the value of all of those assets at whatever is stated, say you have $100 worth of assets, and you can really get $100 for those assets, and you have $50 worth of liabilities, and you're really only going to pay $50, then you have a net worth of $50. At the end of the day, you have $50 cash sitting in your hand. On the other hand, you could have a situation where your assets are $50, and you'll only get $50 for them. You really are going to pay $100 in liabilities, and therefore you have a negative net worth. At the end of the day, you will be short $50, or negative net worth.
Alright, before we get into your opinions, let's talk generally about how you conduct a forensic investigation of this type. Typically, how would you start a financial forensic accounting investigation?
Well, you ask for as many documents as you can get, because again, it's not a sampling of documents. It's everything you can possibly look at. And you get as much information as you possibly can during that relevant period of time. And the place we typically like to start with is a set of financial statements, and those being a balance sheet on an income statement, potentially to help us understand what's going on within that company or that individual's financial condition position.
Okay, I think maybe this would be a good point to segue into your PowerPoint presentation.
Objection. Foundation. Relevance. Court ruling.
The PowerPoint presentation is. What does it consist of?
It consists strictly of some basic information about what Mr. O'Brien does. It also describes his expert opinions in this matter, and it also includes the specific information that he relied upon in forming those opinions.
So it's demonstrative of his testimony?
Yes, it is, Your Honor.
Have you seen the presentation? Have you seen the materials?
I was handed a couple of documents that, I think that has it.
Yes, I provided it to counsel yesterday. Actually, day before yesterday.
Generally, this is the kind of thing that if the witness was given a piece of chalk, he could go to the blackboard and, as he testified, put this up.
He's referencing select paragraphs from documents, one after another, without showing the whole document, and that would be one of our objections as well.
And if counsel wishes to introduce those documents at the end of his cross-examination, I don't think we'll have an objection to that.
I'll let you go forward with it on my theory that it's the type of help a witness normally could do with a piece of chalk or a marker and some butcher paper, but in these days we do it with PowerPoint. If it appears to be something beyond that type, I'll have to re-evaluate it.
Very well.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Alright, if we could have, input 1, Your Honor. Alright, if I may approach, Your Honor, and provide the laser pointer to the witness. I'll give you this to use, if you wish. If you could, Mr. O'Brien, please take us through the components of a financial statement.
The components of a financial statement, as shown up on the board, are really made up of 4 different components, the first being the balance sheet. And all that is a statement, part of the financial statements that are typically referred to in a set of financial statements, that lists out the assets and the liabilities, and then shows net worth. And it literally does balance. That's why they call it a balance sheet, because the total of assets will equal the total of liabilities plus net worth, so it balances. So it's simply a listing of assets and liabilities, and then it shows net worth as the difference.
I'm sorry. Before you ask the next question. I thought you were through with your answer. I want to have Mr. Sneddon and Mr. Mesereau approach for a moment. Discussion held off the record at sidebar. All right, counsel, go ahead.
All right, thank you, Your Honor. I think we were at income statement.
And the second statement within a set of financial statements is an income statement, and that simply lists out all of an individual's or company's income or revenues, and it subtracts out all of the expenditures or expenses. And the difference between those two is either a net income or a net loss. So that's the income statement. The third is what's called a statement of cash flows. It is simply a statement that shows cash, and where cash came in and where cash goes out. And at the end of the year, it shows what the ending cash balance is. Just cash. And then the last component of a set of financial statements is notes. And those notes are a narrative addition to all of the numbers, and they're simply informative. They simply tell you the basis that the financial statements are put together and some of the different accounting policies and principles used in accumulating the financial statements.
All right, let's look at the next slide. What do you look for in these financial statements?
You first try to get an understanding of the business, or the assets and liabilities. You then look at the significant assets and liabilities and try and understand what those are. You look for unusual relationships, ones that you should do additional information and/or additional research on. And then lastly, you just look for unusual issues that should be considered during your investigation.
All right, in this particular investigation, were you able to find any financial statements?
We did, yes. We found a June 30, 2002, financial statement.
All right, what type of financial statement was this?
It was a balance sheet only. Just that first statement, just the balance sheet showing assets and liabilities.
Okay.
And net worth.
And that's what you've described as being balancing out. Subtract the liabilities from the assets, you have a net worth?
That's correct.
Okay, so let's talk about what this particular June 30, 2002, balance sheet said about Mr. Jackson's assets and liabilities.
Your Honor, could we have the exhibit marked?
Yes.
Certainly.
We'll renew our objection based on the court's ruling.
Yeah. The ruling that you're talking to me about is the ruling limiting the financial presentation.
Yes, Your Honor.
He's made an offer of proof in his written materials that is within the scope of what I anticipated him to do. The problem and the reason I have blacked out the screen is that if you're relying on documents that are evidentiary in nature in your presentation, they first must be introduced into evidence. The witness wouldn't be allowed to put parts of a document in evidence that is not in evidence. So,
I would just say that this is offered as expert testimony. And expert testimony may be based upon inadmissible evidence that's not normally admissible. And these are the specific documents that he is basing his opinions on, including hearsay and a variety of other, so typically
But usually, all right. Go ahead. The foundation for the figures is what I was looking for.
All right.
The objection is overruled.
All right. Going back to your consideration of this particular balance sheet, tell us what it said in terms of Mr. Jackson's assets versus liabilities at that particular date.
This showed that as of June 30, 2002, there was $130 million in assets, $415 million in liabilities, and a negative net worth of $285 million.
Okay. Now, as far as this balance sheet goes, does it mean that Mr. Jackson is, by virtue of that balance sheet, bankrupt?
No, it doesn't.
Why do you say that?
Because the balance sheet is prepared on what's called a cash basis, or an income tax basis. And that means that the assets are actually listed at their cost, not necessarily their fair market value. So those assets could have higher values, and they could have lower values. The liabilities could have higher values, they could have lower values. It's just a cash basis. In other words, what was paid for the assets. So, no, it does not mean that. You have to look at it more from a fair market value.
So this does not mean Mr. Jackson has $285 million more liabilities than assets at this time?
The statement shows that. However, it's on a cash basis, which means if you want to get into the real world, you have to look at it more from a fair market value perspective.
Okay, so as a beginning point to your investigation, would a balance sheet like that be a cause of any concern?
You certainly look at it and question as to why there's a negative $285 million net worth. I mean, that's certainly a concern and a consideration. But it simply means that more investigation needs to take place.
Were there other documents that you were able to review to give you a better picture of Mr. Jackson's financial condition?
Yes. I mean, we asked for things such as bank statements and general ledgers, which is a group of transactions that gets accumulated to become the financial statements. We asked for those types of things. We were not given those. We have not seen those. However, we did see about 4 to 5 boxes of other documents that were principally correspondence between Mr. Jackson's financial advisors and some of his advisors and/or himself. So where he actually had hired financial advisors to take care of his money and his assets and pay his bills, that correspondence was made available to us, or some of that. So we actually looked at those to try and get a better understanding of his financial condition during that period of time.
And in a forensic investigation such as this, do you typically have all the documents you want?
No. You might have more than we had, but you don't typically get all the documents you want.
Based upon what you were able to look at and consider in this case, were you able to form some opinions with regards to Mr. Jackson's financial condition leading up to February of 2003?
Yes, we were.
Okay. I'd like you to take us through your opinions in this case that were based upon these documents.
Objection. Foundation.
Overruled. You may proceed.
All right. If you would, please tell us about the opinions you formed based upon your review of all the financial documents you've described that were in these boxes that you reviewed.
Based on the information we saw, Mr. Jackson's financial condition had been deteriorating up and leading into February 2003, evidenced principally by a significant amount of overexpenditure over what was being made. In other words, expenditures exceeded income. Secondly, that the liabilities, the obligation side of things, the obligations and liabilities were increasing steadily and fairly significantly. And lastly, there appears to be an ongoing cash crisis. You'll see a number of the memos that we looked at that talked about cash crisis. Not enough cash to pay bills, etc. And then lastly, I believe that information, based on the documents that I've seen, was certainly known as of February of 2003.
All right. Have you prepared a diagram of this particular slide, Mr. O'Brien, that you brought with you?
I think there was a blow-up of that made, yes.
If I may approach, Your Honor. And I've shown this to counsel. And I'd like to just place it on the easel so Mr. O'Brien can refer to it during his testimony.
Your Honor, we're going to object just to the comment on their seeking documents and they're not finding them, to the extent it suggests that the defense didn't produce something, and move to strike.
I'll strike that comment.
All right.
Go ahead.
Okay. I'd like you to.
Have you seen the chart that he?
Yes, I did. I did receive a copy, Your Honor.
Okay. So let's talk about the first opinion that you've expressed about Mr. Jackson's financial condition deteriorating. If you could, tell us how you arrived at that particular conclusion.
Well, as I mentioned, it was principally the documents that we reviewed, and principally in this matter some of the correspondence received from Mr. Jackson's financial advisors to either him or his other advisors about his cash position.
Okay. And referring to slide number 5, if you'd take us through that.
Yes. Through some of these correspondence, it's apparent that there was.
Just a moment. The jurors can't see.
Can't see.
Oh, I'm sorry. My apologies. If I may place this down in the well or, let me just try and adjust it here. No, that's not going to work. Is that all right? Okay. All right, if you'd please.
We came to that conclusion based on reviewing a number of different documents. It seemed to point to the following three things fairly consistently. 1. That there was approximately $20 to $30 million per year overspending. In other words, spending over what was being made. That has a tendency. Going back to that balance sheet, if you're not increasing your assets, and you don't have the income to support that kind of expenditure, your debt goes up. And when your debt goes up and your assets don't go up, back to the balance sheet, your net worth goes down. So that is a tendency to look at that talks about deteriorating financial condition, first and most importantly, an overspending of that nature and that number. And, 2, then, a decreasing net worth. And that was caused by the third bullet point, which is the fact that the debt increased almost $70 million between 1999 and 2003.
Alright, so let's talk about the first thing you mentioned, his overspending habits, then how you come to your conclusions based on that. First of all, you mentioned these primary assets, two music publishing catalogs?
Well, I believe that, based on my review of the balance sheet, there are really three main assets, certainly one of them being the MIJAC catalog, which is publishing rights to certain of Mr. Jackson's personal performances and songs. And second is a Sony ATV catalog, which is a library of copyrighted songs and performances by both Sony and Mr. Jackson other than the MIJAC catalog. Those would be two main assets. And those are income producing, because they produce royalties and create income to Mr. Jackson. The third main asset would also be Neverland Ranch, which is a fairly substantial and significant asset.
So what documents did you rely upon to come to the conclusion that he was overspending?
That was correspondence from his financial advisors.
Okay, I'd like to start by going back to 1999 and then take us up to 2003 and 4. In 1999, did you consider any correspondence from Mr. Jackson's financial advisors in your forensic investigation?
We did, yes.
Did you recall a letter dated October 13, 1999, from Holthouse?
Yes, it was Holthouse Caitlin and Von Trapp, sick, or something like that.
Okay, who is? Can you determine from the correspondence who is Holthouse Caitlin and Von Trapp, sick?
That is a CPA firm in Los Angeles that appeared to be acting as Mr. Jackson's financial advisors, business managers. They literally paid the bills, they kept track of the assets. And they reported back to Mr. Jackson or his advisors as it relates to financial condition and status of bills, etc.
So they were actually cutting the checks to the vendors and people that Mr. Jackson owes money to?
Apparently so, yes.
Okay, back to this 99 memo. Does it make any reference to unpaid bills?
It does, yes.
Alright, let's look at the next slide.
Objection. Relevance. Court ruling.
Overruled.
Specifically, what does it tell you about Mr. Jackson's unpaid bills?
It says that Holthouse was short approximately $780,000 to meet our outstanding liabilities, meaning at that point in time they were short in cash $780,000 to pay outstanding invoices or obligations due by Mr. Jackson and or his entities.
In this letter, does Holthouse offer any suggestions or concerns?
They do, yes.
What do they say?
They go on to say.
Objection. Hearsay.
It's relied upon for his opinion.
I'll sustain the objection to the hearsay. He's allowed to form his opinion on that type of material, but he isn't necessarily allowed to repeat it, the material he forms his opinion on.
Okay. Alright, so they expressed concerns about Mr. Jackson's overspending?
That's correct.
Your Honor, am I permitted to continue the PowerPoint presentation?
Well, you can't show that material. You're quoting hearsay quotes from other people that have to have limiting instructions, and that's exactly what I asked you at the beginning, what the material was about. I wouldn't allow a witness to go to the blackboard and write down what someone else told him. You've got that in the PowerPoint presentation?
This is the specific statement that he relied upon to form his opinion, from the defendants.
I understand that. He's given his opinion.
Okay. So looking at the records, going through the records, did Mr. Jackson appear to heed the concerns of the Holthouse accountants, of his Holthouse accountants?
No. The expenditure levels seem to continue throughout 1999, as evidenced by comments made within the Holthouse memos.
Okay.
Same objection. Excuse me. I'm going to object to relevance. 1999.
I'll be happy to make an offer of proof as to why we're starting here.
The objection is overruled.
Is there an indication, during this period, from Holthouse as to how much Mr. Jackson is receiving in income versus how much his expenditures are?
Yes. In one of the memos, it stated that Mr. Jackson was receiving.
Objection. Hearsay.
The problem we're having here. I'm going to talk to the jury a second about this. To the jury, the expert is allowed to use this type of material to form an opinion on. But you, as a jury, are not allowed to accept that material for the truth of the matter asserted. It is hearsay, and it is only being presented to show you what he relied on. So with that limiting instruction, I will allow him to state, to answer your question.
Okay. Would you like the question repeated?
No, I have the question in mind.
Okay.
In fact, in 1999, there was a memo, it was actually in 2000, which summarized the 1999 income statement, and basically said that there was approximately 11.
Objection. Hearsay.
Overruled. Go ahead. With the same limitation.
Stated that there was approximately $11.5 million received on the MIJAC catalog and the Sony ATV catalog, $5 million on the MIJAC, $6.5 million on the Sony catalog, for a total revenue of about $11.5 million, if my math's correct. At the same point in time, there was expenditures of over $20 million, made up of approximately $5 million in legal and professional fees, $5 million in security and ranch expenditures, $7.5 million in personal expenditures, and $2.5 million of other miscellaneous, which was principally insurance. So total income of $11.5 million and expenditures of over $20 million.
Alright. Now, you've mentioned previously this MIJAC catalog and the Sony ATV catalog. Does it appear, based on these records that you have reviewed, that these are his two main assets? You mentioned Neverland, but are these the main assets over and above Neverland?
Well, those are the main income-producing assets. I mean, as I said, I think there's three main assets, the two catalogs and Neverland. But the MIJAC catalog and the Sony ATV catalog are the two income-producing assets which generate royalties off of those copyrighted performances.
What is a music publishing catalog?
It's really a library of copyrighted songs or performances which a manager or an administrator sells into the commercial market. Either they sell it by playing it on the radio, they sell it by allowing a movie to use the song, a TV show to use the song, advertisements to use the song, or they might sell sheet music. Each and every time that song is played or that sheet music is used, you get a royalty off of it. So that generates money, which is captured by a royalty capture device, and then that is sent to MIJAC catalogs for all of the MIJAC songs, which again principally were Mr. Jackson's personal compendium of performances, or for the Sony ATV, which was that catalog. That generates revenue.
Okay. Now, the MIJAC catalog consists of what?
As I mentioned, that was principally Mr. Jackson's personal compendium of copyrighted songs and performances. That's what the MIJAC catalog is.
And the Sony ATV catalog?
The Sony ATV was a joint venture or a partnership between Sony, who contributed a number of their copyrighted songs. I think it started out principally as country western, and Mr. Jackson contributed his copyrighted performances of songs, other than MIJAC, which at the time there were a number of different performances, but some of them were the Beatles' hits.
And is Mr. Jackson's interest in the Sony catalog a part interest?
Yes, it is.
Objection. Foundation.
Sustained.
Is Mr. Jackson the sole owner of the Sony catalog?
Objection. Foundation.
Sustained.
Do the records that you've reviewed indicate whether or not Mr. Jackson is the sole owner of the Sony catalog?
Objection. Foundation.
Overruled. You may answer that question.
Yes, the records indicate that Mr. Jackson is a part owner of that catalog with Sony as the other partner.
Okay. Now, you've given us a breakdown of the $20 million in expenses.
Objection. Misstates the evidence.
Sustained.
Did you give us a breakdown of the $20 million in expenses that, for the 99 period in that March Holthouse letter?
I did, yes.
Okay. Were there any additional liabilities over and above the $20 million that Mr. Jackson accrued during the previous year based on that letter?
Yes, there were.
What are we talking about?
It's about $11 million of interest expense on the two loans. There's two loans with B of A that are secured by, one by the MIJAC catalog. The royalties in the MIJAC catalog are used as collateral against, first it's a $15 million loan, and then a $20 million loan, and it continues to go up. And then there's the Sony ATV catalog is used as collateral for approximately $140 million of loans from B of A, and those two loans in 1999 incurred about $11 million of expenditures, $11 million of interest that would be added to the $20 million to come up to a total expenditure.
Okay, so let me paraphrase and see if I have this right. In 1999, before this letter was written, Mr. Jackson had $31 million in liabilities. Is that correct, approximately?
$31 million of expenditures.
I'm sorry, $31 million in expenditures?
That's correct.
And he had $11.5 million in income?
That's the income coming off of the two catalogs, yes.
So he's spending millions more than he's making?
The evidence shows that he's spending about $20 to $30 million more than he's making.
Now, is that an annualized issue? Are you saying, he's making 20 or 30, or spending 20 or 30 more than he's making per year?
That's correct.
Is that what we're talking about?
That's annually, yes.
Okay, so, you've mentioned some loans that he has accrued, some debts. Who was the lender in those loans?
Bank of America.
Can you tell at this stage what types of loans those are?
Well, one is what's called a line of credit, which means you can borrow from zero to the total amount of the loan possible. And the other was just a set loan. Started at $140 million, and it's grown to $200 million.
Okay, so we're still looking at the Holt House memo of 2000. At that stage, what was that loan?
In 2000.
In March.
In March of 2000, I believe that loan was $24 million.
Okay, and then were there any other loans at that point?
Well, there was the B of A loan for $140 million. There was the $24 million B of A loan on the MIJAC catalog. And there was an additional $26 million owed to Sony.
Okay, and what is the Sony loan related to, if you could tell us?
It appeared to be some 1994 transaction where $26 million was owed.
So the previous Holt House letter you talked about said that he had around $800,000 in accounts payable.
Okay.
Is that right?
Well, it said that there was not cash available to pay approximately $800,000 of outstanding obligations.
So those are bills that he has that he didn't have the money to pay?
Correct.
How does his outstanding obligations versus cash look at the point where we're at now, in March of 2000? Does the letter reflect his ability to pay his obligations at that point?
As I recall, the memo from Holt House said that at that point in time.
Objection. Hearsay.
Overruled. You may answer, with the same limitation that I instructed the jury on earlier. Go ahead.
Approximately $3.5 million of outstanding obligations as of that date in 2000.
Does Holt House express any additional concerns about his assets, the vitality of, or the risk that's being presented by this overspending concerning his assets?
Objection. Leading and hearsay.
Sustained.
Are there any other concerns that are expressed by Holt House in this memo?
Objection. Leading and hearsay.
Sustained. Calls for a narrative.
Okay. Does Holt House talk about any possible tax liabilities in this letter?
Objection. Hearsay.
Overruled. You may answer.
They do, yes. What's talked about is, they mention in the letter that if Mr. Jackson and his entities continue to overspend by $20 to $30 million a year, that the collateral for those loans is the catalogs. That's what secures the catalogs. Just like your car secures your car loan, those catalogs secure those loans, or your house secures your mortgage. And their concern is that if that rate of spending continues, that those catalogs could be in jeopardy. In other words, he may have to sell those, even if he could sell them. And if, in fact, you sell those catalogs, there's a substantial tax liability. So you not only have to pay the debt, but you also have to pay the taxes on the sale of those catalogs. And it talks about that issue and that being a concern of Holt House.
Does Holt House write an additional letter expressing their concerns in June of 2000?
Objection. Hearsay. Leading. Foundation.
Overruled. You may answer.
They do, yes.
And do they discuss the issue of how much available cash or remaining debt on these loans Mr. Jackson has to fund his current obligations?
They do, yes.
What do they say?
At that point in time, there was the $20 million line of credit that was basically, Holthouse even says in the memo that it's really, that line of credit and the other debt is funding his living expenses. And the memo goes on to say that at that point in time, $9.2 million has been lent or drawn on the line of credit. Meaning that there's only another $800,000 available on that line to fund living expenses for an indefinite period of time.
Do they describe any spending restrictions on Mr. Jackson that need to go into effect?
They do. Concerned over that cash situation or that cash crisis, they immediately state that they will no longer pay any bills unless authorized by the client, and
Objection. Hearsay. Foundation.
Sustained.
All right, moving on to June 14th, just a few days later, did they send another memorandum? Did Holthouse send another letter to Mr. Jackson?
they did, yes.
Do they talk about Mr. Jackson's rate of spending specifically in that letter?
Objection. Hearsay. Foundation.
Overruled. You may answer.
Yes, they do.
What do they say?
They continue to act, or they continue to say they are concerned about Mr. Jackson's rate of spending. And again, he is spending approximately $20 to $30 million more than he's making per year.
Did they specifically say that?
Yes.
What is Mr. Jackson's debt at this particular juncture? Is it mentioned in these documents?
Objection. Foundation and hearsay.
It's
compound.
compound.
I'll go ahead and withdraw the question. Do these documents that you've described so far say anything about Mr. Jackson's debt that he is now servicing at this point in time, on June 13th or June 14th of 2000?
They do, yes.
What do they tell you about his debt at that point?
Objection. Hearsay.
Overruled. You may answer.
As I recall, they mention that the Bank of America debt is at $200 million, which is securing the ATV catalog. And as I recall, the line of credit is up to $35 million at that point in time.
Okay, and do they talk about his ability to pay unpaid vendors or bills in that letter?
Yes. It goes on to state that Holthouse is unable to pay vendors, that vendors continue.
Objection. Hearsay.
Overruled. Go ahead.
And that vendors are continuing to threaten alternative action if they are not paid.
Does Holthouse warn Mr. Jackson of an impending problem?
Objection. Leading. Hearsay.
Overruled.
Yes. It goes on to say, back when, it said back 3 months earlier.
Objection. Non-responsive.
Sustained.
Could you just confine your answer to any warnings that are given in the June 14, 2000, Holthouse letter?
Yes. The warnings are that, again, that the catalogs are now at risk. And that's the MIJAC catalog and the Sony ATV catalog, because again, they are securing those loans, and those loans continue to increase.
Did you consider a memorandum from So-Young Lee to Myung-Ho Lee?
I did, yes.
And who is Myung-Ho Lee?
Apparently he was a financial advisor to Mr. Jackson.
And the date of this letter was? Do you recall it?
I think it was October of 0001, possibly.
And in this letter, does Miss Lee forecast future spending for the period, 16-month period of September 2000 through December 2001?
Yes, she does.
How much spending is forecast?
Objection. Hearsay. Foundation.
Overruled. You may answer.
A little over $31 million for that 16-month period of time.
So what does that equal on an annualized basis in terms of spending?
If my math is right, about $24 million per year.
Alright, so has that been an increase from the previous documentation that you reviewed concerning Mr. Jackson's expenditures when he was warned back in, I think it was, March of 2000?
Yes. The 1999 expenditures were $20 million, plus approximately $11 million of interest. The projection by Ms. Lee was $23 million for that year, and that did not include the $11 or $12 million of interest expense. So those expenditures are continuing to increase.
Were you able to determine whether or not these forecasts were accurate as far as future spending?
No, we did not see those documents as to actual expenditures in 2001.
Did you ultimately look at documents from 2004 that showed his level of debt during that period?
Yeah, we saw how the debt increased 2001, or 2000 through 2004.
And was the increase in debt commensurate with these predictions of excessive spending by So Young Lee?
Yes, as I mentioned earlier, the debt increased approximately $70 million over a 3-year period of time. And that would tend you to believe that it was about $20 to $30 million per year increase. The debt was increasing because the expenditures increased over the income levels.
Did you consider a February 13, 2003, memorandum from International Business Management?
I did, yes.
And who is International Business Management?
They appear to be another financial consulting firm that was assisting Mr. Jackson and/or his advisors.
Okay. Does this letter mention anything about Mr. Jackson's rate of spending?
It does.
What does it say?
Objection. Hearsay.
Overruled.
It says that they are concerned about his excess spending habits, his continued excess spending habits over his income.
Do they cite any specific figures?
I think it was $20 to $30 million again.
Okay. Does that letter talk about how much money is building up in the unpaid vendors category?
It does, yes.
What does it say?
Objection. Relevance. Court ruling.
Sustained.
Does it say how much cash is left to pay these vendors?
Objection. Court ruling.
Sustained.
Does it say anything about the status of his current loan balances in February of 2003?
Objection. Hearsay.
Overruled. You may answer.
It does, yes.
What is that?
At that point in time, it mentions that the MIJAC loans are approximately $70 million. And the B of A loan on the Sony ATV catalog is approximately $200 million.
Does it say whether or not he has sufficient cash to pay his bills?
Objection.
In that month, February of 2003.
Leading. Hearsay. Foundation. Court ruling.
Overruled. You may answer.
Yes. It states that at that point in time there are $10.5 million of unpaid vendor invoices. And there's only $38,000 of cash in the bank.
Okay, so if we can summarize what has happened to his debt since 1999, what was his debt with the Bank of America as of 2000?
Well, in 2000, the debt was approximately $155 million.
And let's go now to February of 2003.
That debt has grown to $224 million.
$70 million in 3 years increase?
That's correct.
Have you reviewed loan documents, these loan documents for the 2 loans that or for the loans on these music catalogs that you've talked about?
I did, yes.
Do they have any covenants or conditions?
They do, yes.
Any covenants regarding accruing additional debt?
Objection. Foundation. Hearsay. And leading.
Overruled. You may answer.
Yes, there is a covenant. Covenants, well, there is a covenant that says that there's no additional debt allowed unless approved by Bank of America.
Is there a covenant against, any covenant regarding, I should say, further encumbering these 2 assets? In other words, getting more, mortgaging them further with another agency?
Yes. There is also a covenant that says that Mr. Jackson and/or his businesses are not allowed to further encumber these 2 catalogs. In other words, the only loan that can be on these 2 catalogs is the 2B of A loans.
So,
We'll take our break.
Your Honor, we have a motion to make.
Not now.